Hey, I'm John,
And I'm Josh.
and this is Dungeon Brew, where we talk about all things homebrew.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
So I think that to start out with, we should probably give a little bit of framework here for what social encounters look like, what we mean by social encounters. So Joshua, do you want to start off with that?
I think it's oftentimes probably the most overlooked aspect of gameplay. And I don't know that it was always that way, but it seems like with the introduction of video games primarily in the role-playing genre, we oftentimes see engagements with NPCs or other aspects of the fantasy world as being very dry. You know, the barkeep is just giving you information or the next adventure to do or basic stat information or you have some local that's just giving you the new rumor that's floating about or something along those lines. But when I think of social encounters, it's a little bit more than that. It's having NPCs with motivations of their own that you can engage with during the course of gameplay. It's having a political system intact. It's having religious affiliations within society. It's having factions of monsters and creatures and those things that the characters can go explore and investigate and decide their level of involvement in those types of things, and it's having those opportunities essentially set up for the characters. This may also be seen within the characters themselves with their own motivations and who they are and their personalities and engaging between each other, that I think oftentimes as a DM we don't have as much impact or effect on how well they use those amongst each other, but more of how well they employ them throughout the world that we've created and the social elements within it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you kind of drew on video games because it's almost the notion of the, World of Warcraft. There's a big blinking quest marker over their head. Go get the quest, go do the quest, come back, turn it in for a reward. Not that there's not a social piece there, but you just kind of click through it. And as a character in those games, you don't have anything to say. You just kind of listen to the exposition and then click accept and then walk off. There's not really any back and forth. There's nothing pulling you in to be able to say your piece or to have any response to what's going on. And so the social pieces become somewhat lost. And you're saying that you kind of see that coming into RPGs as well?
Yeah, and it may just be in terms of the development of how much, RPG video games have played a role into our society and people's gameplay overall. I mean, when I'm not playing D&D, I'm playing video games. Like, it's very true that that's like two parallel interests that I have, and I see other people around the table have similar interactions with, or similar hobbies in what they do outside of it. So it's almost like they draw that over, and they're like, well, this is how quest finding happens. This is how social interactions happen in that. And so they mirror it, where it's like, oh, yeah, talk to your barkeep and get the local quest. Go out and kill the bandit camp and come back and tell the barkeep. Or here's your local mayor. He's got this quest. Go out and do this and come back again. And there's very little, there's not a lot of meat to the engagement. It's very one-dimensional.
So how do you add dimension? How do you add meat then?
A big piece of it goes back to the motivation behind the person that's giving the quest to you. Why do they want those bandits killed? Why do they want that stone found? Is there a nefarious purpose behind it? Is it completely omnibenevolent in what it is that they're trying to do for the townspeople? Is there some other layer to the particular character and why they want this thing done? Maybe this Jarl wants you to destroy that bandit camp because they're the one last defense between him and another town of a side kingdom that he's trying to infiltrate. There could be something else layered there, and so by you turning that in allows him to do more things in the world that can impact your gameplay later on. Now that's kind of a macro level of what to do, but there's probably more small individualistic things that you could do as well. And even the way that we as DMs portray that NPC to our characters can denote, what their true nature is. Are they more, are they like a charlatan in the way that they speak to you? they seem very forthright, forthcoming, and kind in their engagement with you. What things can you kind of display about that character to give the players, I guess, that slight push into asking more questions or talking to other NPCs in town to get more information before agreeing to the quest, or something else to kind of promote that social engagement in game?
Right. So that's interesting. I mean, there were a couple of things in there that I kind of keyed in on, but I'm going to respond to the most recent first because that just made my brain light up. Because when I do NPCs, I there's a couple of ways I approach them. Sometimes I will create an NPC that I purposely make likable because I want the characters to like them, and I want them to do whatever that character wants them to do. Other times, I will create an NPC that is correct, that is right, that has good intentions. There's nothing wrong with them in terms of like what they do, and I will make them purposely unlikable. I will make them the most heinous bastard on the planet. But there's nothing wrong with what they're saying, and sometimes it's playing on it's playing on the social aspects of the game and our preconceived notions of who we think is worthy of our time and worthy of our attention. And players, in particular characters, there's definitely a sense that when a character comes across somebody who is unlikable, that they immediately assume that there's something wrong with that person, that they have nefarious intentions, etc., etc. So I think it was Tolkien who you talk about how when they meet Aragorn comes across as kind of like this really burly, unlikable kind of clipped guy, and they say I think I'm mixing the characters, but one of them says something along the lines of, I don't think that I think that if he had evil intentions, he would come across as being more fair. Whereas those with good intentions aren't necessarily always the case. And that's something that I like to do, is the evil is sometimes more fair. They come across as more likable. You have more compassion for them. You have more willingness to help that person because sometimes it's just going, I'm going to make this person really attractive in the player's eyes, or I'm going to make them more pitiable. So it's a child or an old man or an old woman or something like that. And I've definitely gotten my players to engage with that person and kind of put on blinders because they fail to adequately question this person because they simply assume that, whatever it is at face value. And then, like I said, I do the opposite as well. It's like I make that person who really is in desperate need, who is willing to reward the players, et cetera, there's nothing wrong with what they're saying, or what they're saying is perfectly reasonable, but they come across as being so unlikable that the players oftentimes will automatically assume that there's something wrong with them. Which this is a little off key, but it's like I just find that fascinating from a social perspective to really force the players, because after I'd done that a couple of times, then the players really started to get into the social aspect of it. It's like, wait a second, and part of it is like, oh, you can't trust him, you can't trust the DM, but the thing that I'm really after is then they're forced to really engage in social interaction. You don't accept what is on the surface ever after you've played a couple of sessions with me and I've done that to you.
Well, that's one of the things that I love about the games that you run. I mean, you know how important the social aspect of D&D is to me. It's one of those things that drives me to want to continue playing the game because I like exploring those elements. It's also one of the things that I liked a lot about 3.5 in their player handbook too, was the different factions that there were, and it even gave you directions on how to create your own factions within the world that gives the entire society, the whole culture, a different feel to it when you're in the course of gameplay, and forces you to learn about things and even rewards you for being part of factions,
right,
with different benefits that you have. But in the games that you do, John, you always have motivations for all your NPCs. Even the lowest guy that we cross on the road that's out hunting trolls or peddling furs, he has motivations. To your high kings that are in cities, to the leaders of your churches, to the leaders of the Thieves Guild or some other developed faction that's within the city, you always have a motivation there. And there's always layers to what each one of them are trying to accomplish, what they want to do, who they're allied with, who they're enemies with. And that, to me, is most intriguing, is to start unraveling that and peeling it back to figure out what the core truth is of the world that I'm exploring and that I'm engaging within. And I think that you've always done that with your work, even if you don't think about it so much. And I know we oftentimes will play with individuals that aren't as interested in that aspect. They like the combat more, they like the exploration more. But for me, the social piece is probably the driving force behind me liking to play D&D. Because it's like a mystery that I'm trying to solve.
Right. And so some of it is, like I said, that I like to do a lot of... I like to pull the wool over the player's eyes in terms of don't make assumptions about what this character is or what this NPC is. Don't just assume that because they appear to be a certain way that they are a certain way. They always have their own motivations. The other piece of it is, and you make it sound way more complicated than it is in terms of fleshing out NPCs, because I just have a generator. I generate a personality, and usually, like with any generator, any random table, I take the pieces and I tweak them and I go, oh, no, this NPC really should be this way. But for some things, and you guys have had access to this. You guys used it in the Beckney campaign when you generated your own characters, where it gives you a range from 1 to 20 on, I think it's something like a dozen different personality markers for, are they energetic? Are they lazy? Are they forgiving? Are they vengeful? Are they modest? Are they proud? Are they loyal? Are they unreliable? Things like that. But it gives you a range, and then it's like, when it comes to playing that NPC, it is going, okay, I know that this person is honest and loyal, and so whatever they're saying is going to be true. They're not going to betray the players at any point in time. But I also roll those, and sometimes it's like that's not the case. Sometimes they're lazy and deceitful, and so that means that they're not going to have the patience to do the long con, and they're going to tell you something, and the first night alone with them, they're going to try and pull something. So it really kind of varies, and like I said, you make it sound really complicated, like I've got all these master plans, but really it is, I sit there and go, okay, they're going to meet this person today, and I click a button, and it rolls out my generation, and I go, okay, I know what that person's like, and I put that in a stat block, or I put that off to the side so I know who it is.
And that makes sense, but I think
right.
you do well in taking those random roles and creating a link between them, between NPCs and between factions and between cities. Like the association between them and how you allow them to fit together like a puzzle in the course of storytelling works really well. And we've all heard that adage that everything I learned from everything I learned about life I learned from D&D. And for me, the social encounters is a big piece of that. Like we don't take what we learn in D&D and go, oh yeah, I learned how to blow up a bunch of kobolds with a fireball. That's not the stuff that we're talking about. That's not the aspect that we carry on for those who've been playing D&D for years. It's learning about how our predisposition towards certain archetypes, impact our thinking, and how the people that we see, even in the course of gameplay in that social role, is echoed in the real world in a lot of different ways. And the way that we engage in those social encounters, I think, can teach us a lot about real life too. We don't have to go down that path right now, but there's a lot of benefit, I think, in having well-constructed social encounters for your players to engage in and explore, because they learn how archetypes fit. And why is it that when I see this giant, warrior with a great sword on his back and these dark hair and, these piercing eyes, that I immediately think that he's this overly, confident, robust man that's going to be harsh in his tenor and etc., instead of him having a completely different personality affiliated to him or associated with him during the course of gameplay.
Right.
And playing with those archetypes and allowing characters to really dive underneath the layers to figure out who these people are outside of that first presentation, I think gives us a lot of real-world examples of what we should be doing, too, in the course of life.
Yeah, and archetypal play, because like I said, sometimes I go against the grain. I like to go against the grain. I don't always. I like having an archetype that is an archetype. You come across an elf who is as elfy as an elf could elf. And that is fun to me, too. Like, I really enjoy having those characters that are, this is Legolas at 12, turned up to 12, because that is who you expect it to be. And sometimes that's fun. It's relieving for the players to engage on a social level with somebody who is as they expect them to be. And I do that because I can't have every single person, flipped 180 degrees, because that also then creates its own archetype where it's like, well, but I know that this person is whoever. But what it is it's really, I want the players to feel as though it's necessary to engage with an NPC on a social level to understand what their motivations are. And when it comes to motivations, this is something that you and I developed, 10 years ago, the major, moderate, minor motivations, where you go through, and this is something as a character that you and I do, where we look at the motivation, the major motivation, which is like life goals. These are the things that I want to see done in my life. You have moderate motivations, which are, long-term type goals, and you have minor motivations, which are short-term goals. These are things, I'm doing this today, or I'm doing this week. So you have that motivations, and those motivations are beneficial from an NPC level, because if you have a noble, the noble is going to have those motivations. We have those motivations in life. We have life goals. We have daily goals. We have weekly goals. I want to eventually, retire and do all of this stuff. My life goal is to amass enough money to where I don't have to work when I get to 65 or 55 or something like that. Moderate goals are, I want to be able to graduate college. Minor goals are, I want to make sure that, I am, seeing my family this week. Those are things that you can easily take and put into an NPC, and they don't have to be like these huge drawn out things, but they are something that allow your NPCs to feel more real. And just having a couple of those, especially for NPCs that people are going to be interacting with for any period of time, if it's the Baron of a region, they're going to interact with that person more than once. They're going to interact with them, especially if they're in the region, multiple times. It behooves you as a DM to determine what their motivations are and understand if they're ticking those things off their list. Because the minor motivations for someone like a Baron might be, I need to deal with this Thieves Guild that is in my territory. I need to make sure that I'm discovering who killed my daughter. Those are minor motivations because they're immediate. They're things that need done sooner rather than later. And there are things that once they get ticked off, they get replaced by something new, which is true of us as well. When we have something that we get done, we tick it off of our list and we move on to the next thing. And
there's... Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say that's what you need to be paying attention to is motivations.
Well, I was going to say, and it gives you a blueprint, though, as well. And I don't know if you run this the same way, but when I create the major motivations, they supersede the minor and the moderate. Which, right. If the player can unravel those, then it allows them to have some weight in their negotiations with that particular NPC. If I know your overall goal is to conquer the nation that's next to you, and I can find some way that your minor motivation is incongruent with that goal or goes against it, then I can convince you that that's not the goal that you want to pursue, because then you'll never reach your major motivation. So right. Understanding those and really allowing your characters to go explore them can give them advantages in their deception checks or their persuasion checks or other things, because they then have the knowledge to utilize when they're talking about a ruler, because they understand who they are at a human level.
Right. So we've talked a lot, I think, here about NPC building, maybe motivations, personalities, things like that allow you as a DM to do those things. Allow you as a DM to create scenarios or create believable people in the world, which allow your characters to interact with them. But I think that one of the things that we do need to address is why should a player care? If I can just click through my dialogue and get to the quest and go do the quest and then come back, why as a player should I care what the motivations or other things that in regard to that NPC are?
I think that's a great question. And how do we get our characters to care about those pieces? Because as DMs, many times we fail to reward them for really engaging in social encounters and driving that. I know there's a number of things that you and I have both done in games to try to encourage players to engage in that. One of the ones that I like the most is probably the outside of the game piece, which is incorporating a reputation like point system. So they engage in with NPCs and they do things, and so then they gain reputation points that gives them special permissions when they're in town. It gives them discounts on stuff that they're buying and those types of things because of the great deeds they're doing and the connections that they have with other people.
The favor system.
Yeah, the favor system.
Right.
Another thing that I've seen you do before, and this is out of the Beckme campaign, is that it allowed for other options in-game. Because you don't just, when we're talking NPCs, you don't just say that's like, of your individuals in town, you know, your humanoid creatures that you're working with, whether that's elves or humans. It's even to the point that you can persuade monsters to join you. And for me as a player, that was huge. That was a great reward that I could then convince the kobolds to fight alongside me. I could have mercenaries at my back that were working with me, and it was a huge rewarding game to then have followers, companions that I could utilize based on the roles or the rules that you've developed.
Right. So, and that was, I think it was a class-based thing. So, you know, most lawful classes could recruit mercenaries or followers or something like that in town, but specifically the Avenger class and the Orc class that I wrote up were specific to being able to recruit monstrous allies. So, like you said, kobolds, orcs, trolls, other monstrous creatures that would choose to be a part of your retinue if you were successfully, you know, engaging in social interactions with them in some way. Which I feel like, yeah, is a huge boon. That is something as a player I would want. And generally speaking, when I DM, I try to do as much that if I would want it as a player, I assume that one of my players will probably want it too.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, what other rewards do you give players for engaging in that social piece to make it important to them as a DM?
Well, I mean, since we're already talking about, in-game followers and things like that, if you're talking about in-game character rewards, it's pretty easy to look at other archetypes where if you're running something like a fighter of some kind, maybe if you're doing deeds and you are having successful social interactions with the local ruler of that land, whether it's a baron or a king or something, you're knighted, you're brought into nobility. So the more that you engage in the social pillar of play and you are playing the political game, at least to one degree or another, you're being rewarded in game for things like that. And you could extend that outward into other areas as well, where if you have a wizard of some kind, a magic user, who is engaging in social interactions with the local cadre of, mages, then maybe he's inducted into their ranks and joins that faction. Maybe he's given secret magics that are not available normally for other magic users. So he has access to spells or to spell abilities that he wouldn't have just as part of his normal class. There are a number of different ways. And D&D 5e builds in inspiration as well. So even just like for minor social encounters, what we're talking about, with the knighthood and things like that, that's a big scope, right? That is like, I've been working my butt off and I've been doing this for several levels and I've finally gotten that reward where I've been knighted or I've been inducted into this mage group. But just inspiration, just experience points, just things where it's like, listen, you guys handled that social interaction really, really well. I'm going to give you guys XP for it. That's the macro level reward. That is the thing that they look for and they go, listen, okay, so this is what the DM wants from me. This is how I get a reward on a player level, in their minds. You reward the behavior you want to see in game. Reward social interaction. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, that is awesome advice. I know I'm taking a couple of steps back here, but I just want to give this other example of something that you've done specifically. A couple of examples based on what you're talking about. One, in the Kazar Karath campaign, it got to a place that our reputation had gotten so high and that we were rewarded so much for our social interactions that we were able to build strongholds.
Right.
We were able to use your stronghold building tool that you had created, and that in itself was fabulous. Many of the players really enjoyed that aspect of it. But another example, this is years ago, we played the Three Brothers campaign. That was a very heavy social game for D&D that we did. But in the course of that, based on our social interactions, we got access to specialists and spies and running institutions and getting extra income coming in, and all sorts of things in order to weigh favor in this very heavy political social campaign we were playing in order to gain power and control in different subsections of the city. And it was tons of fun for those that are in that type of gameplay. That if you're rewarding that, you can get some huge benefits. You know how wonderful it is to have a whole group of spies running around delivering information to you. It allows you to know how to move your actions and what missions to pursue in order to get the most bang out of your buck.
And so just to provide a little bit of context for that campaign specifically, because that might be a little confusing out of context. The notion was that there were three players. They were all brothers who were princes underneath the king. The king was ill and he was dying, and they were all vying for favor from the king, trying to eliminate. So it was a very adversarial style of gameplay, in which they were either trying to secure the throne for themselves, if that's what they wanted, or they had a favorite brother. So some of you guys were actually trying to secure the throne for somebody else other than yourselves. And you were basically doing political intrigue type stuff against one another. The thing is that you just couldn't, if you wanted the throne for yourself, you really just couldn't come out and kill a brother, because that would be too obvious. If you did something like that, there's no way you would get the throne. So you guys were engaging in political intrigue where you were trying to, undermine each other, and at the same time not be undermined yourselves. So yeah, it was a hugely social thing where you guys were constantly in contact with not only each other, trying to manipulate one another to do what you wanted to do, but also manipulate officials in the city and secure wealth and influence and power and all kinds of stuff. I found that game to be a ton of fun.
It's definitely memorable.
So, which, in terms of political games, it's like that is, it was a ton of fun. It required a lot of legwork to build all of the social interactions for all of the NPCs that were involved in that game. And you guys did a fantastic job of role-playing your characters as well. There wasn't much combat, it was, I think you guys met once a week where it's like you were trying to do something in order to secure your positioning and that type of thing. And sometimes you were actually fighting against the factions that you yourself were trying to support. So you would go on a mission and try and undermine your own brothers in the middle of a mission so that you didn't take heavy losses on your own supporters. And that was another aspect of it where it was like you had to do the cloak and dagger thing while you were being actively observed by your brothers. So it was a lot of fun.
And if I remember correctly, it was also that there were outside regions that knew the king's illness that were trying to infiltrate the city and take over the city for their own as well and expand their own land. So
it was on the brink of war type situation. So I believe that one of you was actually trying to sell out the city to the people who were trying to actually come in and take over the city. So yeah, there was a ton going on there. Just multiple factions, multiple ways to approach it. And that style of gameplay, like the notion of the political gameplay, is something that I see a lot in forums where people are constantly trying to figure out how to get that to work effectively. And it really is a player-driven thing. It is much easier if you have player buy-in. It is much easier to get that style of campaign off the ground. If you're wanting to run one and your players aren't on board, it's just not going to work, unfortunately. But once they've got the buy-in, or once you have buy-in from the players, you let them drive it. You let them go, hey, listen, I've got this idea for this thing that I want to do. And then you build out in front of them. It is the idea that, I have this idea. I want to contact the local thieves guild. And you may know who the local thieves guild are. You may know that there are 3 thieves guilds. You may know that they're in conflict with each other, and you kind of give them options. Options is always the best choice when it comes to that type of thing. And they go, I want to contact, thieves guild B, and you just make sure that you flesh that out for the next session. I do that a lot in games that I like to run where I give options. And when it comes to social interactions, building too far out ahead is going to drain you. But if your players are willing to understand that it takes time to do that type of thing, which most of mine are, it's not that big of a deal to just say, hey, listen, that sounds like a great idea. I'll have the information for you, the next session or whenever I can. And usually that's pretty acceptable.
Well, I hope this has been useful information for the folks that are watching it. If you didn't catch our first 2 videos on combat encounters and exploration encounters, then please go check those out as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you guys want to hear more on this topic, let us know too.
Dungeon Brew.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us today. Please check out some of the stuff we're doing. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, join us on our Discord, or go and watch us stream on Twitch, where we're at 4 or 5 days a week. All the links are down below. We look forward to hearing from you.
Dungeon Brew.
Yeah, it's hard to shut us up.
Dungeon